Friends, we've now been basking in the joy of the risen Christ for a full week, and today we reach the end of the octave of Easter. This Sunday traditionally goes by several different names. It is called Dominica in Albis, Low Sunday, Quasimodo Sunday, the second Sunday of Easter, and more recently, it's become the observance of Divine Mercy Sunday. Each of these names conveys something important about what this Sunday's celebration means for us as Catholics, as Christians. First, Low Sunday. It seems odd, but consider how it's juxtaposed to the beginning of the octave of Easter. Can any day of the year really compare with Easter Sunday? Of course not. It's a name whose origin we don't fully know, but it conveys to us a sense that although part of the octave, Low Sunday pales in comparison to the glory of Easter Sunday itself. Dominica in Albis, its proper liturgical name, translates as Sunday in white garments, and it comes to us from the fact that those neophytes who would have received their white baptismal garments at Easter now lay them aside for the first time, something that St. Augustine makes reference to in one of his sermons. Quasimodo Sunday is my personally preferred title for the day for a couple of reasons. First of all, I'm a nerd, and I like things that are different and a bit arcane. Anybody who knows that will agree. And then, of course, I have a great love of Victor Hugo's masterpiece, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Those of you who have read it will recall that the child left on the foundling's bed of the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris was given the name Quasimodo because he was found on this Sunday. And this Sunday takes its name from the proper introit or entrance antiphon, the officially prescribed musical text that ought to begin the Mass, which is taken today from the first letter of St. Peter, Quasimodo geniti infantes, like newborn babies. Yet another reference to the neophytes who were given new life in the waters of baptism. And then the more recent title, the uninteresting second Sunday of Easter, rather straightforward and self-explanatory. And finally, the Sunday of Divine Mercy, an observance on this day which harkens back to the devotion of the Divine Mercy of Christ, detailed in the writings of St. Faustina Kowalska and promoted by Pope St. John Paul II, who codified it as part of the celebration of this day with the most recent edition of the Roman Missal in the year 2000. So there right there is lots of information that I find interesting, but most of you are probably sitting there thinking, what's the point? Well, does there really have to be? I mean, all of these titles for today point back, as well they should, to the significance of Easter. They make clear to us that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is more than a liturgical observance. It is the linchpin of our entire year, the axis on which our year revolves, and I dare say, the axis on which our lives ought to revolve. Now let's look for a moment at this weekend's gospel, the famous story of doubting Thomas. John makes it clear that, for whatever reason, Thomas was not with the apostles in the upper room when Jesus first appears to them. But a week later, he is, and Jesus returns again. This time, he rather targets Thomas, and he leaves him with what I consider to be one of the most important rules to live by that Jesus can give to his church. Blessed are they who have not seen and yet believe. It seems every year I seize on this short phrase because of what it means to us as a people of faith, and particularly in these days when public masses are not being held. Our faith, by definition, must be more than only what we are able to see and experience. Faith, as the Church teaches, is one of the theological virtues. It leads us to God. Faith is our response to the overtures of God to invite us to share in his divine life. And by living lives of faith, we freely submit our intellect and our will to him. To be a people of faith, to believe, is more than simply having an idea or a feeling. Faith is ultimately about submission, about how we freely give ourselves over to God. Frankly, as human beings, it's something that we're rather loath to do. We like our freedom, our independence. We are self-determined, and what we want most out of life is to be able to set our own course, our own destiny. But nothing could be farther from what God desires for us or what faith demands of us. Even Thomas. Consider his response to the apostles telling him that Christ had risen. I won't take your word for it. I have to determine it for myself. It has to be my experience, my effort. When he encounters our risen Lord, what happens? Jesus meets him where he is and says, fine. Put your fingers in my hands. Put your hand into my side. Stop your posturing and your doubting in order to seem more intelligent or somehow superior. Believe. One of my favorite depictions of this event was painted by Caravaggio. Of course, having my many Roman tendencies, I've always gravitated toward his work, but this one is especially important, not just as a painting, but as a theological treatise. Look at the rather graphic depiction of Thomas inspecting the wounds of Jesus. You can see his finger in Jesus' side, lifting up the skin. But notice where Jesus' hand is in all of it. He's holding Thomas's wrist, guiding him. That touch right there is not Jesus forcing Thomas to experience his resurrection, but rather is his grace guiding him. God does not force our belief. He invites, he entices, he guides, he doesn't force. Think of our current situation in this pandemic. We spend so much time griping and reflecting on what has been taken away from us. Our liberty, our self-determination, our independence, even our right to the sacraments. But in our selfishness, and in some cases in our overly developed sense of persecution and outrage, we blind ourselves to the greater mystery of what God has placed before us. A time for renewal, for reflection, for finally working to build up the domestic church. A time for slowing down and reprioritizing our lives. A time for working into a fervor our desire for him in the sacraments. Christ Jesus, in these moments, is taking our hearts and guiding them to where they ought to be. Hearts that beat not for ourselves, but for love of him and love of others. These times make it far too easy for us to think about ourselves, hoarding groceries and supplies, shutting ourselves in, fearing for our own well-being. But our mission is still one of charity and love for God and neighbor. We have to be reaching out, as I've been saying over the past few weeks. Call your neighbors, share your supplies with them. Pay forward some of your stimulus money to help out local charities, those people who are working overtime to help ease the burdens of so many. Look at the first Christians in our reading from the Acts of the Apostles, that first community in and around Jerusalem. St. Luke says that awe came upon everyone. They were amazed at their unity in faith. They ate their meals with exultation and sincerity of heart, praising God and enjoying favor with all the people. Are we living like that in our days? Does that accurately reflect how we're going about our daily lives right now? I certainly hope so. Because nothing has changed from then until now as far as what God is expecting of us. Friends, challenges about these days, but are no more than in any other age. They're just different, and we're all learning to adapt. What is of paramount importance is that we continually pivot back to the Paschal mystery, letting the joy of Easter remain our spiritual anchor that keeps us grounded and reminds us continually of what God expects of us, to live lives rooted in Him, dependent on Him, quasimodo geniti infantes, like newborn babies who have been given life in abundance and the guiding grace to achieve what St. Peter calls the goal of our faith, our salvation. May God bless you this day, and may you continue to have a happy and holy Easter season.